Today's story follows Blake, a troubled teen known for his anger and bad choices. But when he crosses paths with an elderly man in the park, a simple encounter turns into a life-changing lesson. Blake's journey from aggression to self-discovery unfolds in unexpected ways, as he learns that real strength comes from respect and discipline. Will Blake break free from his past or be consumed by it? Stick around to find out, and if you're ready for more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Comment below, what do you think happens when Blake meets Mr. Jenkins? Let's dive in. The sun was high over the town of Maple Creek, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets. It was the kind of place where every lawn was manicured, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. To Blake Harper, it was suffocating. At 16, he had long since given up on trying to fit into the mold the town expected. His mother worked 2 jobs, and his father had walked out years ago, leaving a gaping void that Blake filled with anger. He sat in the back of a beat-up truck, surrounded by his friends Nick, Josh, and Ryan. They were his crew, though Blake wouldn't exactly call them friends. Friends were people you trusted, people who had your back. Nick, Josh, and Ryan were more like shadows guys who followed Blake because they were scared not to. Nick was the loudest, always cracking jokes, often at someone else's expense. Josh was the enabler, nodding along to whatever Blake said, eager to keep the peace. Ryan was the quiet one, always on the edge of the group, but never contributing much except his presence. Blake didn't care about their personalities as long as they made him feel powerful. And that was the thing, he needed that power, the control over something, because everything else in his life felt like it was spiraling. The truck pulled into the local park, and the boys hopped out. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the field, the trees, and the old, rusted playground equipment. The park was mostly empty, save for a few scattered joggers and a man sitting alone on a bench. "Who's that?" Nick asked, his tone already hinting at mischief. Blake glanced over and saw him, a black man, probably in his 60s or 70s, feeding birds from a crumpled bag of bread. His back was slightly hunched, his hair peppered with gray, but there was something about him that seemed calm, untouchable, as if the world's problems didn't concern him. Blake narrowed his eyes. "Looks like someone wandered too far from his neighborhood," Blake muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. The others chuckled, following Blake's lead as they always did. The truth was, Blake didn't know why he felt that instant surge of resentment. Maybe it was because the man looked peaceful, something Blake rarely felt. Or maybe it was because he looked different, and in Maple Creek, different wasn't welcome. Without saying another word, Blake started walking toward the man, his crew following close behind. As they got closer, the man glanced up, but didn't say anything. He just looked at them, his eyes calm, unfazed by the group of teenage boys looming over him. "Hey, old man," Blake sneered, standing directly in front of him now. "You lost or something?" The man looked up, meeting Blake's gaze with an intensity that made Blake pause for just a second. But he quickly masked his hesitation with arrogance. "Just enjoying the day," the man said softly, his voice steady, almost too calm. Blake didn't like it. The man's calmness felt like a challenge, as if he was refusing to be intimidated. Blake felt his anger flare, and without thinking, he gave the man a shove. The old man didn't fall. He barely moved, in fact. Blake's friends snickered behind him, but there was an edge of nervousness in their laughter. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" Blake continued, his voice hard. "This isn't your park." The man sighed, brushing a few crumbs off his lap. "You boys should go home," he said, his tone still kind. But there was something different now, a firmness beneath the surface. "There's nothing good for you here." Blake's temper flared. He was being told what to do by some old man, no less, in front of his friends. Without thinking, Blake's hand shot out again, but this time the old man was ready. Before Blake could register what was happening, his wrist was caught in a grip stronger than he could have imagined. The man's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. "You don't want to do this," the man said quietly, but there was no fear in his voice. "Only certainty." Blake yanked his arm back, his heart pounding in his chest. His friends watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The air around them felt thick with tension. Blake stepped forward again, fists clenched, ready to show this man that he wasn't scared. But just as he swung, the old man moved with a fluidity that Blake hadn't expected. In an instant, Blake's balance was taken from him, and he found himself on the ground, staring up at the sky, his breath knocked out of his lungs. The laughter from his friends stopped. They stood there, wide-eyed and frozen, as the old man stood over Blake, not angry, but calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. "You should be careful about where your anger takes you," the old man said softly, then turned and walked away, his steps slow but deliberate, leaving Blake gasping for air on the ground. Blake's humiliation was complete. He had never felt so powerless in his life, and as he sat there, watching the man disappear down the path, something deeper than embarrassment settled into his chest, a nagging sense of shame that he couldn't shake. Blake's humiliation burned like a brand on his skin as he trudged home, his friends walking in awkward silence beside him. No one said a word about what had just happened, and for that, Blake was thankful. He didn't know how to explain it anyway, how some old man had knocked the air out of him without even raising his voice. How that calm, steady gaze had made Blake feel small in a way he'd never felt before. Once he got home, he slammed the door behind him, throwing his backpack onto the floor with a force that rattled the dishes in the kitchen. His mother, exhausted from her double shift, looked up from the table, her eyes weary but curious. "Blake, you okay?" she asked cautiously. "Yeah, I'm fine," Blake snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "Just had a rough day." She didn't push, but he could see the concern in her eyes as she turned back to her bills, her hands trembling slightly as she calculated numbers. Blake's chest tightened. He knew she was struggling, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, but that only made him angrier. Angrier at her for being weak, at his father for leaving, and at himself for not being able to fix anything. He stormed up to his room, slamming the door behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands shaking with frustration. His thoughts raced back to the old man in the park, the way he'd barely even blinked when Blake had tried to intimidate him. How could someone so old, so fragile-looking, make him feel so powerless? Blake punched the mattress, but it did nothing to relieve the tightness in his chest. He could still see the man's face, hear his voice, calm and steady. "You should be careful about where your anger takes you." Why did that line keep playing in his head? It wasn't like the old man was right. Blake wasn't angry, he was just frustrated. He had a right to be, didn't he? With everything going wrong in his life, with his father gone and his mother barely holding it together, wasn't he allowed to let off some steam? Blake tried to push the memory of the encounter out of his mind, but it clung to him like a shadow. That night, he barely slept, the old man's words echoing in his mind, stirring something he didn't understand. The next day at school, everything felt off. Blake couldn't shake the feeling of unease, like the ground beneath him was shifting. His friends tried to joke around as usual, but even their laughter felt hollow. "Yo, Blake," Nick said, elbowing him in the ribs as they sat in the back of the cafeteria. "What was up with that old guy yesterday? Dude's a freak, right?" Blake forced a laugh, but it felt wrong. "Yeah, total weirdo," he muttered, but the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He didn't feel like talking about it. He didn't feel like laughing. And the more Nick went on, the more Blake felt that nagging sense of guilt tighten in his chest. By the time lunch was over, Blake was ready to explode. He couldn't stand the way his friends were acting, like nothing had changed, like the encounter hadn't meant anything. But it had. To Blake, it felt like something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't explain. A few days passed, but Blake's sense of unease only grew stronger. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old man's face calm, unwavering, and strong in a way Blake had never been. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could one small encounter rattle him so much? At home, his temper flared even more than usual. His mother was constantly on edge, tiptoeing around him as if she was afraid of setting him off. And in truth, she wasn't wrong to be cautious. Every little thing seemed to make Blake snap. Whether it was her asking him to clean up after himself or reminding him about his homework, he felt like he was on the verge of losing control all the time. One evening, after another argument with his mother, Blake stormed out of the house, needing to clear his head. He wandered through the neighborhood aimlessly, his hands jammed into his pockets, trying to drown out the voices in his head. He found himself walking back toward the park where it had all started. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he was hoping to see the old man again, to confront him, to finally get the upper hand. Or maybe he just needed answers. But when he got there, the park was empty. The bench where the old man had sat was vacant, the pigeons nowhere to be seen. Blake stood there for a long time, staring at the spot, wondering why it bothered him so much that the man wasn't there. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window of a nearby shop. He looked tired, angry, lost, and in that moment, he realized something he had been avoiding for a long time. He didn't like the person he was becoming. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, and for the first time, Blake felt something other than anger. He felt shame. Shame for the way he had treated the old man, for the way he had treated others, and for the way he had been living his life. As he walked home that night, his mind was racing. He didn't know how to fix the mess he had made of his life, but for the first time, he wanted to try. This part sets up the emotional conflict, introduces the characters, and creates the initial catalyst for Blake's transformation. The tension between Blake's outward aggression and inner turmoil builds throughout the chapters, pushing toward the first emotional climax, when Blake begins to feel the weight of his actions and the shame that follows. Blake couldn't escape the guilt gnawing at him. Days turned into weeks, but the encounter with Mr. Jenkins stayed with him, like a splinter lodged in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to shake it off, that old man's calm voice kept playing on repeat. "You don't want to do this?" At school, everything felt off. Blake walked through the halls with his usual swagger, but it felt like a performance. Nick, Josh, and Ryan still followed him, but even their presence annoyed him now. They were stuck in the same routine, laughing at the same jokes, bullying the same kids. But something had shifted in Blake. The things that used to make him feel powerful just left him feeling hollow. One afternoon after school, Nick suggested they head to the park again. The weather was perfect for messing around, and it wasn't long before the group fell back into their usual antics, picking on younger kids, throwing a few insults here and there. But when they passed by the same bench where Mr. Jenkins had sat, Blake felt his stomach turn. He stopped, staring at the empty spot, half expecting the old man to appear out of nowhere. "Hey," Blake, Nick called, breaking the moment. "What are you doing? Let's go." Blake snapped out of it and followed the group, but the unease stayed with him. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him was relieved that the old man wasn't there. The shame was too fresh, too raw. Every time Blake thought about Mr. Jenkins, he felt like he was being torn in two, the part of him that wanted to stay in control, and the part of him that knew he was on a destructive path. That night, as Blake lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he tried to understand what was happening to him. He had always been angry at his dad for leaving, angry at his mom for not being able to fix it, and angry at himself for feeling so lost. But now that anger felt different. It felt more like fear that maybe Mr. Jenkins had been right about him. Blake sat at the back of the classroom, zoning out as the teacher droned on about social issues. Normally, he wouldn't care about the topic, but today something grabbed his attention. Marcus, a black student who Blake had barely spoken to, was giving a presentation on systemic racism. Blake could feel the tension rise in the room as Marcus spoke confidently, his voice unwavering as he shared statistics and personal stories of discrimination. As Marcus talked, Blake's hands clenched into fists under the desk. He didn't know why, but something about Marcus' speech made his blood boil. Maybe it was the fact that Marcus spoke with so much conviction, or maybe it was the way some of the other students nodded along as if they understood something Blake didn't. Either way, by the time Marcus finished his presentation, Blake was fuming. When the bell rang and students started filing out, Blake couldn't hold it in any longer. He stormed up to Marcus, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nice speech. Guess you think you're some kind of expert now, huh?" Marcus, who had been packing up his things, looked up at Blake calmly. "Just speaking the truth, man." Blake scoffed, his anger bubbling over. "Truth? You really think people care about your sob story? This town isn't some racist hellhole like you're trying to make it sound. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm not talking about the town. I'm talking about real experiences, Blake. But I don't expect you to get it. That was it. Something inside Blake snapped. Without thinking, he shoved Marcus, sending him stumbling backward into a desk. The classroom fell silent as the other students turned to watch, their eyes wide with shock. Marcus straightened up, his eyes narrowing. You really want to do this? Blake's fists clenched at his sides. He felt the same anger he had felt with Mr. Jenkins, the same need to prove something. But there was something different about Marcus' expression. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he looked disappointed, like he had expected more from Blake. Before Blake could make another move, the teacher rushed in, separating the two of them. That's enough, both of you, she snapped, her voice firm. Blake stormed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had always been the tough one, the one who controlled the room. But now, for the second time in his life, he felt like he had lost control and it terrified him. The confrontation with Marcus left Blake spiraling even deeper. Over the next few days, his temper flared more often, and his mood swung between anger and confusion. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with him, but he didn't know how to fix it. Every time he thought about Mr. Jenkins or Marcus, it was like a knot tightened in his chest. Blake's friends noticed the change, but they didn't know how to deal with it. Nick tried to joke around like usual, but Blake wasn't in the mood. Even Josh, who normally went along with everything, started keeping his distance. Ryan, the quietest of the group, barely spoke anymore. One afternoon, Blake found himself wandering back to the park. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted to prove to himself that the encounter with Mr. Jenkins hadn't affected him as much as he thought. But as he approached the park bench where Mr. Jenkins had been sitting, the shame hit him all over again. The bench was empty, but in his mind, Blake could still see the old man sitting there, feeding the pigeons with that unshakable calm. It made Blake feel small, like all the anger and power he had been holding on to was nothing compared to the quiet strength Mr. Jenkins had shown that day. Blake sat down on the bench, his hands gripping the edge as he stared at the ground. He could feel the emotions building inside him, but he didn't know what to do with them. He had spent so long being angry, being tough, he didn't know how to be anything else. Suddenly, he punched the bench, his fist slamming into the wood with a sharp thud. Pain shot up his arm, but he didn't care. He punched again and again until his knuckles were raw and bleeding. Tears stung his eyes, but he fought them back. He wouldn't cry, not here, not now. Crying was weakness, and Blake had spent his entire life trying not to be weak. But in that moment, sitting on the park bench with blood dripping from his knuckles, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't strong. He had never been strong. He had just been angry, and that anger had been eating him alive. Blake sat there for what felt like hours, the pain in his hand throbbing in time with the pain in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix the mess he had made of his life. By the time Blake got home, his mother was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. She noticed the blood on his knuckles immediately. "Blake, what happened?" she asked, rushing over to him. "It's nothing," Blake muttered, trying to brush past her. But his mother wasn't having it. She grabbed his arm, pulling him into the kitchen. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice trembling. Blake reluctantly let her clean his hand, wincing as the antiseptic stung his skin. As she worked, her eyes filled with tears. "What's going on with you, Blake?" she asked quietly. "You've been so angry lately, and I don't know how to help you." Blake looked away, guilt tightening his chest. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know how to explain what was happening to him because he didn't fully understand it himself. All he knew was that the anger he had been holding on to for so long was starting to turn on him. His mother sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not your father, Blake. You don't have to be like him." Those words hit Blake harder than anything else. He had spent so long trying to be tough, trying to be the man of the house, but deep down, he had always feared that he would end up like his father, angry, bitter, and unable to hold on to anything good in his life. As his mother finished bandaging his hand, Blake felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He didn't want to be angry anymore. He didn't want to keep fighting battles that only left him feeling more broken. But he didn't know how to stop. That night, as Blake lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he decided. He couldn't keep going down this path. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this. He had to find a way to let go of the anger before it destroyed him completely. The days following Blake's breakdown in the park passed in a fog of guilt and confusion. He had pushed everyone away, his mother, his friends, even himself. The bruises on his knuckles were healing, but the shame he felt was deeper and harder to get rid of. It clung to him, an invisible weight that made everything seem dull and heavy. At school, Blake avoided Marcus, Nick, and anyone else who might remind him of what he'd done. He kept his head down, doing the bare minimum to get by, but inside, his thoughts churned endlessly. He replayed every hurtful word, every punch, every insult he had thrown over the years, and it sickened him. The worst part was that he didn't know how to make it stop.
The guilt was like a wall blocking him from moving forward, but he couldn't go back either.
It was as if the person he had been arrogant, angry, and reckless was dead. But the person he was becoming was still a stranger to him. At home, things weren't much better. His mother tiptoed around him, unsure of how to break through the wall he had built between them. Blake could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at him, but he couldn't bring himself to talk about what was going on inside him. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand? One afternoon, Blake sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling, feeling more lost than ever. He thought about Mr. Jenkins again, the old man's calm voice, the way he had handled Blake's aggression without ever raising his voice. He had been so sure of himself, so steady, while Blake had been a mess of anger and confusion.
Blake didn't know why, but part of him wanted to see Mr.
Jenkins again. Maybe the old man had answers, or maybe he was just looking for some kind of closure. Either way, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to talk to him, even if he didn't know what to say. The next day after school, Blake made his way back to the park. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the familiar bench, hoping, maybe even praying, that Mr. Jenkins would be there. To his surprise, the old man was sitting there, just as he had been the last time, feeding the pigeons with slow, deliberate movements. Blake stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to approach him. His mouth felt dry, and for a moment he considered turning around and leaving. But something inside him told him to stay. Taking a deep breath, Blake walked over to the bench and sat down beside Mr. Jenkins. The old man didn't say anything at first. He just kept feeding the birds, his expression calm and peaceful, as if he had all the time in the world. Blake's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he forced the words out. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice shaky, "I'm sorry for what I did that day in the park. I didn't mean any of it." Mr. Jenkins didn't react immediately. He tossed the last of the breadcrumbs to the pigeons, then wiped his hands on his pants before turning to look at Blake. His gaze was steady, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "You don't owe me an apology, son, mister," Jenkins said gently. "The apology is for yourself." Blake frowned, confused. "For myself? What do you mean?" Mr. Jenkins sighed, his gaze shifting back to the birds. "Anger, hate, they're like chains, Blake. They weigh you down, keep you trapped. You can carry that weight around for years, and it'll eat you up inside. But letting go of it, that's the hard part. That's where real strength comes in." Blake felt a lump forming in his throat. He had spent so long being angry at the world, at his father, at everyone who had ever let him down. But what had it gotten him? Nothing but pain. "How do I stop being angry?" Blake asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Jenkins smiled softly, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "You start by forgiving yourself. You've made mistakes, sure. We all have. But you can't let those mistakes define you. You can't let the hate win." Blake nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. But something about Mr. Jenkins' words made sense in a way that nothing else had before. It wasn't just about apologizing for what he'd done. It was about letting go of the anger that had been controlling his life for so long. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the park, Blake felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't a complete release. He knew he still had a long way to go, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, Blake felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The next few days were a blur of quiet reflection for Blake. He couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Jenkins' words, "The apology is for yourself." It echoed in his mind as he went about his daily life, lingering in the back of his thoughts as he tried to make sense of everything. One Friday afternoon, Blake found himself standing outside the school gym, waiting for Marcus. He hadn't planned on confronting him, but the guilt gnawing at him was too much to bear. He knew he couldn't keep running from the things he'd done. He had to make it right somehow. When Marcus finally appeared, heading toward the exit with a group of friends, Blake felt his stomach twist in knots. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced, but he couldn't back down now. "Marcus," Blake called, his voice more urgent than he intended. Marcus turned, his expression cautious. He stepped away from his friends and approached Blake, his face unreadable. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his tone guarded. Blake swallowed hard. The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. I wanted to apologize. For what I did, and for what I said. I was wrong, and I know I hurt you." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Blake's face as if trying to figure out if the apology was genuine. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of Blake's guilt. Finally, Marcus sighed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why now?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. "What's changed?" Blake hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything that had been going on inside him. How could he sum up the anger, the shame, and the confusion that had been consuming him for so long? How could he put into words the effect that Mr. Jenkins had on him, the way the old man's calm strength had made Blake realize how wrong he'd been? "I don't know," Blake admitted, his voice quiet. I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to keep hurting people just because I'm angry. I've been trying to figure out how to fix things, and this is where I need to start." Marcus' expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "And you think one apology is going to make up for everything?" Blake shook his head. "No, I know it's not, but it's the best I can do right now. I'm trying to change, Marcus. I really am." Another long silence passed between them, but this time it wasn't as tense. Marcus seemed to be weighing Blake's words, deciding whether to accept them. Finally, Marcus sighed and nodded. "All right," he said, his voice calmer now. "I appreciate the apology, and I hope you do change." Blake exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a start. That was all he could ask for right now. "Thanks," Blake said, relief washing over him. Marcus gave him a small nod before turning to leave, his friends waiting for him at the door. As Blake watched him go, a sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in a long time, Blake felt like maybe he wasn't so lost after all. He still had a lot to learn, and he still had a long way to go, but he was finally ready to start the process of healing both for himself and for those he had hurt along the way. Blake hadn't expected the apology to Marcus to feel as heavy as it did. It was like a weight had been lifted off his chest, but there was still something holding him back, a lingering sense that there was more to do. The apology had been just the first step, and while it had felt good, Blake knew it wasn't enough. Mr. Jenkins' words echoed in his mind constantly. "You need to forgive yourself." But how could he do that when he still wasn't sure who he really was without the anger? The only thing he knew was that he didn't want to go back to the person he had been. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day at school, where Nick, Josh, and Ryan had grown even more distant, Blake found himself wandering back to the park. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that he needed guidance, and the only person who seemed to have any answers was Mr. Jenkins. Sure enough, the old man was there again, sitting on the same bench, feeding the pigeons just as he had before. Blake approached cautiously, unsure of how to start the conversation this time. He felt awkward, like a child seeking advice from an elder, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Mr. Jenkins' calm presence. Blake sat down next to him without saying a word. For a long moment, they just sat there in silence, watching the birds flutter around, pecking at the crumbs scattered on the ground. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice quiet. "I talked to Marcus." "Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly, his gaze still on the pigeons. "How did that go?" Blake sighed. "He accepted my apology, but it didn't feel like enough. I don't know if we'll ever be able to make things right." Mr. Jenkins turned to look at Blake, his expression thoughtful. "Making things right isn't about fixing the past, Blake. You can't undo what's been done. What matters is how you move forward from here." Blake looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of those words. Moving forward, it sounded so simple, but in reality, it felt like the hardest thing in the world. How was he supposed to move forward when he didn't even know where to start? Mr. Jenkins seemed to sense Blake's struggle. "You ever hear of martial arts, son?" Blake blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "Yeah, of course. Karate and stuff, right?" Mr. Jenkins smiled, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "Something like that. I used to practice martial arts karate, specifically for many years. Taught it too. But it's not just about fighting. It's about discipline, control, and respect. It's about finding balance in yourself." Blake stared at him, intrigued. "You taught karate?" Mr. Jenkins nodded. "I did. Traveled all over the world, teaching students from all walks of life. But the most important lesson I ever learned wasn't about how to fight. It was about how to stop fighting." Blake frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Jenkins' gaze softened. "It's easy to lash out, to throw punches when you're angry. But real strength comes from knowing when not to fight. It's about having the discipline to control your emotions and the respect to treat others with dignity, no matter who they are." Blake felt a lump forming in his throat. Those words hit him harder than any punch ever could. He had spent his whole life fighting against the world, against his father's abandonment, and against himself. But what if there was another way? What if he didn't have to fight anymore? "I could teach you, if you're interested, Mr. Jenkins offered, his voice gentle. "Not just karate, but the lessons that come with it. You might find what you're looking for in the process." Blake hesitated, unsure of whether he was ready for something like that. But deep down, he knew this was the path he needed to take. It wasn't just about learning how to fight, it was about learning how to live differently, how to control the anger that had ruled his life for so long. "I'd like that," Blake said quietly, his heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. Mr. Jenkins smiled. "Then we'll start tomorrow. Meet me here after school and we'll begin." Blake nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The next day, Blake showed up at the park, his nerves buzzing with anticipation. Mr. Jenkins was already there, waiting for him with a small gym bag by his side. Blake had no idea what to expect from this first lesson, but he was eager to learn, to start the process of rebuilding himself. Mr. Jenkins led him through basic stretches and movements, explaining the philosophy behind karate, how it was about balance, both physically and mentally. As they moved through the exercises, Blake found that the focus required to maintain his stance and control his breathing helped quiet the storm of thoughts that had been swirling in his mind for so long. For the next few weeks, Blake trained with Mr. Jenkins after school, slowly learning the discipline of martial arts. It wasn't just about the physical movements, though those were challenging enough, but about the mental shift it required. Mr. Jenkins emphasized control, respect, and humility, all qualities Blake had struggled with his entire life. As Blake trained, he began to feel the anger inside him slowly dissipate. It wasn't gone completely, but it was more manageable now. He found himself less reactive, more thoughtful in his interactions with others. He started to see the world differently, noticing things he had never paid attention to before, like how people treated each other, how easy it was to be kind instead of cruel. But while Blake's internal world was changing, his external world remained complicated. Nick, Josh, and Ryan noticed the shift in Blake's behavior and weren't happy about it. They mocked him for spending time with Mr. Jenkins, calling him soft, and questioning why he wasn't hanging out with them as much anymore. "Seriously, Blake, you're ditching us to go play karate with some old man?" Nick sneered one afternoon as they walked home from school. Blake's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "It's not like that. I'm just trying to get my head straight." Nick laughed, but there was an edge of frustration in his voice. "Since when do you need to get your head straight? You were fine before. Now you're acting all weird and serious." Blake didn't respond right away. He knew they wouldn't understand, not yet. They were still trapped in the same mindset he had been in for years, caught up in the need to prove themselves through cruelty and toughness. But Blake wasn't that person anymore. Or at least, he didn't want to be. Josh chimed in, trying to diffuse the tension. "Come on, man. Let's go mess around at the park like old times. You've been bailing on us a lot lately." Blake sighed. He could feel the pull of the past, the temptation to fall back into old habits. But he knew that wasn't the right path. "I can't, guys. I'm not doing that stuff anymore." Nick's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "So, what? You're too good for us now, is that it?" Blake shook his head. "It's not like that. I just am trying to figure some stuff out." Nick stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "We're your friends, Blake. Don't forget that." For a moment, Blake felt the old anger rising up inside him, the need to assert dominance, to prove that he wasn't weak. But then he remembered Mr. Jenkins' words. Real strength comes from knowing when not to fight. Blake took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not forgetting anything, but I'm not going back to the way things were." Nick stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he scoffed and turned away. "Whatever, man. Do what you want." Josh and Ryan hesitated, casting unsure glances at Blake before following Nick down the street. Blake watched them go, his heart heavy. He had known this moment was coming, the moment when he would have to choose between his old life and the new path he was on. But that didn't make it any easier. Still, as he walked home that evening, Blake felt a sense of relief. He had stood his ground, chosen not to fall back into the same destructive patterns that had defined him for so long. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. As the weeks passed, Blake continued his training with Mr. Jenkins, and the changes in him became more apparent. He was more focused, more at peace with himself. The anger that had once defined him was slowly fading, replaced by a sense of purpose. At school, people began to notice the shift. Some of his classmates, particularly those he had bullied in the past, were still wary of him, but they couldn't deny that something was different. Blake wasn't picking fights anymore. He wasn't mocking anyone or trying to assert dominance. He was quiet, thoughtful, and more respectful than he had ever been. One afternoon, as Blake was heading to the gym for his usual after-school training with Mr. Jenkins, he ran into Marcus in the hallway. They hadn't spoken much since the apology, but Blake could tell that Marcus had been watching him, waiting to see if the change was real. "Hey, Blake," Marcus said, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. Blake nodded in acknowledgement. "Hey." There was an awkward pause before Marcus spoke again. "I've noticed you've been different lately. What's going on?" Blake hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything that had been happening. But then he realized that Marcus deserved the truth. He had been patient, watching Blake's journey from the sidelines, and now he was offering an olive branch. "I've been training with Mr. Jenkins," Blake said. "He's been helping me figure some things out." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Jenkins? The old guy in the park?" Blake smiled slightly. "Yeah. Has not just some old guy, though. He's been teaching me about discipline and control. It's helping me get my head on straight." Marcus seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "That's cool, man. I'm glad to hear it." Blake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was progress. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn back some of the respect he had lost. As he walked to the park that afternoon, Blake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He wasn't perfect, he still had a long way to go, but he was on the right path. He had chosen to change, and that was what mattered. When he arrived at the park, Mr. Jenkins was waiting for him as always. The old man smiled as Blake approached, his eyes twinkling with approval. "You're looking more confident these days, Mr. Jenkins said as they began their training. Blake nodded, feeling the truth of that statement deep in his bones. I feel more confident. It's different, but in a good way. Mr. Jenkins chuckled. That's because you're learning how to control your anger instead of letting it control you. That's real strength, Blake. Blake smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He still had a lot to learn, but he was finally starting to believe in himself, and that was worth more than anything else. As Blake's confidence grew, so did the challenges that came with it. While his training with Mr. Jenkins was giving him the tools to control his emotions, there were still parts of his past that haunted him, especially his old friends. Nick, Josh, and Ryan had been noticeably absent from his life since their last confrontation, and Blake knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. One afternoon, as Blake was leaving school, he spotted Nick leaning against a car in the parking lot, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Josh and Ryan stood a few feet behind him, their postures tense. Blake's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was it, the final confrontation he had been dreading. Blake walked toward them, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, Nick pushed himself off the car and stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "So, this is who you are now," Nick said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some wannabe karate kid? You think you're better than us now?" Blake took a deep breath, reminding himself of Mr. Jenkins' teachings. This wasn't about fighting. It was about control. "It's not about being better," Blake said, his voice steady. "It's about being different. I don't want to be that guy anymore, Nick. The one who hurts people for no reason." Nick scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, you've changed. And not in a good way. We used to run this school, Blake. Now look at you hanging out with that old man, apologizing to people like Marcus. What happened to you?" Blake clenched his fists at his sides, but he didn't let the anger take over. He had come too far to fall back into his old habits. "I'm trying to make things right," he said, his voice calm. "I hurt a lot of people, Nick. I can't keep doing that." Josh stepped forward, his expression conflicted. "Blake, we've been friends for years. You're just going to walk away from that." Blake sighed. He had thought about this moment for weeks, and while it hurt to lose the people he had once called friends, he knew it was necessary. "I'm not walking away from anything," Blake said, "but I'm not going back to the way things were. You guys can come with me, or you can stay stuck in the same place. It's your choice." Nick's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with anger. "So that's it, huh? You think you're better than us now, and we're just supposed to sit here and take it?" Blake shook his head. "No, I'm not better than anyone. I'm just trying to be better than who I was." For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the air was thick, but Blake didn't waver. He stood his ground, refusing to back down. This was the ultimate test of everything he had learned, the moment where he would prove to himself that he had truly changed. Finally, Nick turned away, his shoulders stiff with frustration. "Whatever, man. Do what you want. But don't come running back to us when this whole respect thing doesn't work out." Blake watched as Nick, Josh, and Ryan walked away, their footsteps echoing across the parking lot. He felt a pang of sadness. Losing them wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary for his growth. This was the final break from his past, the moment where he chose a new path for himself. As he stood there, watching them disappear from sight, Blake felt a strange sense of peace. It hurt to let go of his old life, but he knew it was the right decision. He wasn't the same person he had been, and he couldn't keep pretending that he was. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet reflection and personal growth. Blake continued his training with Mr. Jenkins, each session teaching him more about discipline, respect, and inner peace. The physical exercises were challenging, but it was the mental and emotional lessons that had the greatest impact on Blake. He was learning how to control his anger, how to let go of the resentment that had weighed him down for so long. One afternoon, as Blake and Mr. Jenkins were wrapping up their training session, the old man paused, wiping his forehead with a towel. "You've come a long way, Blake," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I can see the change in you." Blake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I feel different," he admitted, "but I know I still have a lot to learn." Mr. Jenkins nodded. "We all do. Life's a journey, son. The important thing is that you're on the right path now." Blake thought about those words as he walked home that evening. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments where the old anger threatened to creep back in, but he was learning how to handle it. He was learning how to be a better person, not just for himself, but for those around him. The real test of his growth came one Friday afternoon when the school held an assembly in the gym. The event was to honor community leaders, and to Blake's surprise, Mr. Jenkins was one of the honorees. He had known the old man was respected in the community, but he hadn't realized just how much of an impact he had made over the years. As the principal introduced Mr. Jenkins, the gym erupted into applause. Blake watched from the back of the room, feeling a swell of pride for his mentor. This man, this quiet, unassuming man had spent his life teaching others about respect, discipline, and kindness. And now the entire community was recognizing him for it. Mr. Jenkins stepped up to the podium, his voice calm and steady as he accepted the award. "I'm not one for long speeches," he said with a smile, "but I will say this. We all have the power to change, to be better than we were yesterday. It's not an easy journey, but it's a worthwhile one."
And it starts with respect for yourself and for others.
Blake felt those words resonate deep within him. That was what his journey had been about all along: respect. It wasn't just about controlling his anger or apologizing for his past mistakes. It was about learning to respect himself and the people around him, regardless of who they were or where they came from. After the assembly, Blake waited outside the gym for Mr. Jenkins. When the old man finally emerged, Blake approached him with a wide smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Jenkins. You deserve it." Mr. Jenkins chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I appreciate that, Blake. But the real congratulations should go to you. You've done the hard work, and I'm proud of you." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. Coming from Mr. Jenkins, those words meant everything. He had spent so long trying to prove himself to his friends, to his family, and even to himself. But now, for the first time, he felt like he didn't need to prove anything. He was proud of who he was becoming, and that was enough. "I couldn't have done it without you," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Jenkins placed a hand on Blake's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You've had it in you all along, Blake. You just needed someone to help you find it." As they walked away from the gym together, Blake felt a sense of closure settle over him. His journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more challenges to face, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had the tools, the discipline, and the respect to handle it. Later that evening, as Blake walked through the town square, he saw a group of kids playing basketball together, some white, some black, all laughing and joking without a care in the world. A few months ago, Blake would have sneered at the sight, maybe even joined in with his friends to make a cruel comment. But now, as he watched the kids play, he felt nothing but peace. Blake sat down on a nearby bench, watching the game unfold. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the court. For the first time in a long time, Blake felt truly at ease. He had let go of the anger, the hate, and the need to control everything around him. He had learned to respect himself and others, and that was what mattered most. As the kids continued their game, Blake closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't the same person he had been, he was better. And for the first time, he knew that he was on the right path, a path built on respect, discipline, and the quiet strength he had learned from Mr. Jenkins. With a peaceful smile, Blake opened his eyes and watched the sun dip below the horizon, ready for whatever the future held. 1 year after that fateful encounter with Mr. Jenkins, Blake's life had transformed in ways he never imagined. The once cocky, arrogant kid who bullied others for sport had become someone new, someone kinder, more thoughtful, and surprisingly respected by his peers. It wasn't that Blake had become perfect. There were still days when the old anger tried to creep back in, moments when he had to remind himself of everything Mr. Jenkins had taught him. But each time those feelings surfaced, Blake had the tools to manage them now. He knew that strength didn't come from lashing out or proving yourself through aggression. It came from controlling that instinct and making choices that reflected respect and empathy. At school, people saw Blake differently. The students who used to avoid him, who walked the other way when they saw him coming, now greeted him in the hallways. He had repaired his relationships with those he had wronged, like Marcus, and built new friendships with people he never would have considered talking to before. It wasn't easy, but each conversation, each step forward, helped him rebuild his reputation. Even his mother had noticed the change. Their relationship had grown stronger, more open. Blake had started talking to her about the things that weighed on him, about his frustrations, his fears, and the path he had chosen. She was proud of him, and that meant more to Blake than he could express. But there was still one person who hadn't seen the full extent of his transformation: his father. Blake's father had left years ago, abandoning the family without so much as a goodbye. The absence had shaped Blake's anger, fueling the rage that had driven so much of his destructive behavior. But now, a year into his journey of self-improvement, Blake realized he was ready to confront that part of his life. With his mother's encouragement, Blake tracked down his father, who had moved to a nearby city and was living a quiet, unremarkable life. Blake didn't know what he expected from the meeting closure, maybe, or just the chance to finally say everything he had been holding inside for so long. When the day came, Blake stood outside the modest apartment building where his father lived, his heart pounding in his chest. The anger he had felt for so many years was still there, but it was different now, more controlled, less consuming. He wasn't here to lash out. He was here to speak his truth. Blake knocked on the door, his hands trembling slightly. When his father answered, the shock on his face was immediate. He hadn't expected to see his son standing on his doorstep, especially not after so many years of silence. "Blake," his father said, his voice thick with disbelief. Blake nodded, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. "About everything." His father hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, allowing Blake to enter the small apartment. They sat at the kitchen table, an awkward silence hanging between them. Blake took a deep breath, summoning the courage to say what he had come to say. "You leaving it messed me up. For a long time, I didn't know how to deal with it. I was angry. At you, at Mom, at everything. And I hurt a lot of people because of it." His father's face fell, guilt and regret etched into every line. "Blake, I'm not here to blame you," Blake interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I just wanted you to know how it affected me. I spent so many years being angry, and I thought it was because of you. But I've learned that I don't have to carry that anger anymore. I don't have to let it define me." His father stared at him, a mixture of shock and admiration in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Blake. I didn't realize how much I hurt you." Blake nodded. "I know. But I'm not angry anymore. I've let it go. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay now." For the first time in years, Blake's father smiled a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've grown into someone I never could have imagined." Blake smiled back, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. He didn't need anything more from his father, not an apology, not an explanation. He had made peace with the past, and that was enough. As Blake left the apartment that day, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his father's abandonment was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and acceptance. He had taken control of his own life, and that was the most important thing. Blake's final step on his journey came a few months later, when Mr. Jenkins approached him with an offer that took him by surprise. "You've come a long way, Blake," Mr. Jenkins said one afternoon as they wrapped up a training session. "I think it's time for you to start teaching." Blake stared at him, stunned. "Teaching? You want me to teach karate?"
Mr.
Jenkins chuckled. "Not just karate. I want you to teach the lessons you've learned, the lessons about respect, discipline, and control. There are a lot of kids out there who could use someone like you, someone who understands what they're going through." Blake hesitated, unsure of whether he was ready for such a responsibility. "I don't know if I'm qualified for that." Mr. Jenkins smiled. "You're more qualified than you think. You've lived it, Blake. You've walked the path. And now it's your turn to help others find their way." Blake thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. It made sense. He had spent the past year rebuilding himself, learning how to control his anger and live a life of respect. Now, he had the chance to pass those lessons on to others, to help kids who were struggling the same way he had been. With Mr. Jenkins' guidance, Blake began working with a group of younger students at the community center. At first, it felt strange standing in front of a group, teaching the very lessons he had once been so resistant to. But as the weeks went on, Blake found that he enjoyed it. He liked seeing the kids grow, both physically and emotionally. He liked watching them learn how to channel their energy into something positive, something that made them stronger without tearing others down. One of the kids, a shy boy named Tyler, reminded Blake of himself when he was younger, angry, confused, and unsure of where to direct his emotions. Tyler had a lot of potential, but he was prone to outbursts, much like Blake had been. Blake worked with him closely, teaching him not just the physical aspects of karate, but the mental and emotional discipline that came with it. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Tyler approached Blake, his expression hesitant. "Blake," he asked quietly, "do you think I'll ever get better at controlling my temper? I feel like I'm always angry." Blake smiled, crouching down to meet Tyler's gaze. "I know it's hard," he said gently. "I used to be just like you, always angry, always looking for a way to let it out. But you can get better. It just takes time and practice." Tyler nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "You were really like me." Blake nodded. "Yeah, but I had someone who helped me, and now I want to help you." Tyler's face brightened a little, and for the first time, Blake saw a spark of hope in the boy's eyes. That was the moment Blake knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't just teaching karate, he was helping kids like Tyler find their own paths, helping them learn the same lessons that had changed his life. As Blake watched Tyler and the other kids practice their moves, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what Mr. Jenkins had been talking about all along, passing the torch, helping others find their way. And now Blake was part of that legacy. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, Blake felt like he had found his place in the world. He had found his purpose, and that was worth more than anything else. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and growth, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And let me know in the comments, what part of Blake's journey resonated with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next video.
"I know this is unexpected," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I love you, Olivia. I love the life we're building together, and I want to make it official. Will you marry me this time for real?" Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she looked at the man in front of her, the man who had once been her enemy, but who had since become the love of her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the lights of the city sparkled around them. This time their marriage wouldn't be based on a bet. It would be built on love, trust, and the promise of a future they would face together. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia stood together in front of a small group of family and friends, exchanging vows in a quiet, intimate ceremony. It was nothing like their first wedding. There were no business contracts, no hidden agendas, and no expectations of control or power. This time it was real. Olivia's mother was there, smiling proudly as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. Ethan's family, too, had gathered to witness the moment, their support a reminder of how far he had come. As Ethan and Olivia stood before the officiant, their hands clasped together, they exchanged vows filled with love and sincerity. There was no need for grand declarations, just the quiet promise to stand by each other, no matter what the future held. "I promise to love you," Ethan said, his voice steady, "to respect you, and to be the man you deserve, for as long as we both live." Olivia smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And I promise to love you, Ethan, to trust you, and to build a life with you, one filled with love, forgiveness, and hope." As they kissed, The small group of friends and family erupted into applause, but for Ethan and Olivia, the world around them seemed to disappear. In that moment, they were the only two people who mattered. As the months passed, Ethan and Olivia settled into their new life together, their love growing stronger with each passing day. Olivia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as they prepared to welcome their child into the world, they found themselves filled with a sense of peace and fulfillment. Ethan continued his efforts to make amends for his past mistakes, but now he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to atone for his wrongs, he was trying to build a better future, not only for himself and Olivia, but for their growing family. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Olivia resting her head on Ethan's shoulder, she looked up at him with a contented smile. "Who would have thought," she mused softly, "that it would all start with a bet?" Ethan chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's funny, isn't it, that something so ridiculous could lead to something so wonderful?" Olivia nodded, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "But I'm glad it did. Because now we get to build this life together. And that's all I've ever wanted." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Ethan knew that this life, this love was the best thing he had ever won. Not through manipulation, not through power, but through genuine love, hard-earned respect, and the promise of a future filled with hope. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia welcomed their baby girl into the world. As Ethan held their newborn daughter in his arms, tears filled his eyes. He had never imagined that his life could feel this complete, this meaningful. Olivia watched him, her heart full as she saw the joy in his eyes. They had come so far through pain, anger, and betrayal, but now they were a family. A real family. As Ethan looked down at their daughter, he smiled, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He had spent so long searching for power, for control, but now he realized that true strength came from love, from vulnerability, and from the willingness to change. "Welcome to the world, little one," Ethan whispered, his voice full of emotion. "You're going to have an amazing life." Olivia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they looked down at their daughter together. "She's perfect," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She is," Ethan agreed, his heart swelling with love. And as they sat together in the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The beginning of a life filled with love, forgiveness, and endless possibilities. They had started with a bet, but now they had built something that would last forever. What do you think? Do you believe in second chances, or is some damage too deep to repair? We'd love to hear your thoughts on Ethan and Olivia's journey in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more inspiring tales of love, redemption, and hope. Thanks for watching.
And as long as he stayed true to his values, he knew he was on the right path. The night stretched on, full of promise and potential. And as Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. As Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. If you've enjoyed this story of Ethan's journey toward leadership and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below together. We can keep the conversation about diversity and inclusion going. "I was thinking about it too," James said, his voice quiet but reflective. "It feels like so much has happened. But at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come." Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even. Mildred chuckled softly. Maybe, but we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of. That's what you did, James. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. It's not over, James said, more to himself than to Mildred. There's still work to be done. There's always more to be done, Mildred replied with a knowing smile. But you've given this town something it didn't have before, hope. Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine, and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people: James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality. It was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. "We are the generation that will carry this town forward," Lily said, her voice clear and strong, "and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. "Rose's Diner was named after my mother," Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. "She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division." Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "But now I want to reclaim that name," Harold continued. "This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table." The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool as he read her words. Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel. James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. I used to think change was something to be afraid of, Tommy told the teens. But now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking. The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbor's son's strangers had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done. But now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. You'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She too had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here," Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better now, richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.